Morning, everybody. This is Erik Daly from the Miller Johnson Corporate Department. I'm a member in the firm's business section, and among other things, I have a mergers and acquisitions practice, which, as we'll get to momentarily, is not as busy as it has been over the past few years during this last month or two since the coronavirus outbreak has impacted and disrupted business operations and transactions generally. But before we get into some of the trends in the M&A market and how M&A practice may be evolving based on the current circumstances, we always like to start our webinars by reminding ourselves, and I like to remind myself at the beginning of each of these webinars, that our purpose and our goal in hosting these events is to foster collaboration and to carry out our objective of delivering candid, informed, collaborative advice to the community and working with community partners to come up with creative solutions given the challenging times. And so that's sort of the backdrop for this presentation, along with all the others we're doing. The other thing that I like to start with, and that we try to start all of our morning webinars with, is just a quick roundup of some of the more relevant news developments, not necessarily legal issues, but COVID-19 related news developments from the prior day. Today, a few that we chose to highlight were here in Michigan, where we're located. The Michigan Chamber of Commerce launched a website that can help connect businesses to vendors of personal protective equipment, which is helpful in as much as businesses that are starting to be able to reopen under the existing guidance and the new executive order that came out late last week are required to provide employees generally with some kind of face covering, even if it's not the full kind of medical grade PPE. So that website may help businesses procure what they need to comply with the executive order that was released late last week. Also here in Michigan, the state Senate further encouraged Governor Whitmer to allow for elective medical procedures, including elective dental procedures, to start again. I know that hospitals and other healthcare providers have taken a significant blow to their revenue and their financial well-being as a result of not being able to do some of those elective medical procedures over the last month or more. And then the other industry that the Michigan State Senate urged the governor to create a pathway to reopen is construction industry. So we'll see how that evolves alongside the governor seeking extension of the emergency declaration for the state over the next several weeks. Also here in more locally to the Grand Rapids area, Kent County coronavirus cases increased to 205 new cases in a one-day period. However, if you look at the reporting and kind of look at the numbers, it seems like some of the reporting of those new cases is a bit lumpy, and also the fact that there is more testing happening is resulting in more cases being detected and reported. So it's hard to know exactly what that number means overall as a single data point, but it does. It is part of a broader trend of there being more cases reported here on the west side of Michigan, the southwest side of Michigan, compared to earlier on in April. And so whether that's a result of more testing or something more significant, we'll have to keep an eye on the data. And then more hopefully, some of the countries that were impacted before coronavirus became widespread in the U.S., such as Spain and France, have announced some plans to reopen their economies, social life a bit, and gradually ease back into daily routines. And so those will be interesting developments to monitor as different states and different areas of the U.S. regional groups come up with similar plans to resume some version of daily life and economic activity. So with that, why don't we turn to today's topic, which is M&A considerations based on COVID-19 developments. Mergers and acquisitions have really slowed down. So we'll take a look at some of those market trends from the first quarter of 2020 in particular. And then we'll go through some of these other factors that will impact deal making for, I think, a meaningful period of time going forward, such as valuation approaches given disruptions to financial performance and financial metrics. We'll also look at how the current situation is impacting some key terms in M&A agreements, like material adverse change or material adverse effect definitions, key representations and warranties as well. And then we'll take a look at some of the instances where in a more normal environment, there would be provisions relating to requirements to either operate in the ordinary course of business or disclose past events that were outside of the ordinary course of business, and how to deal with that in light of the fact that what we're collectively experiencing is obviously not the ordinary course of business or life in general. We'll then look at how COVID-19 has impacted timing around regulatory approvals and closing conditions, and what that might mean for certain provisions in your transaction agreements. Even if there is a steady decline in the number of cases and the economy begins to open up when deal making sort of starts to increase again, I think being prepared for potential waves of follow-up outbreaks or closures is something to consider in that context. And then we'll close out the presentation by looking at some of the impacts that the situation has had on representation and warranty insurance, which is in general become much more prevalent over the last 5+ years in the U.S. M&A market, and then wrap up by just reemphasizing the importance of due diligence in the M&A context. So let's get into it then on the next slide. Yeah, so M&A market trends, I won't go through each of these, but the upshot of this is that the value and level of activity in terms of number of deals declined pretty dramatically in the first quarter of 2020, both globally and in the U.S., and both compared to the last quarter of 2019. And you would normally expect to see some drop off from Q4 of the prior year to Q1 of the next year, but this was a more pronounced drop off than you would normally see. And then on a year-over-year basis as well, M&A activity, both value of deals and the number of deals, declined very significantly on a year-over-year basis, and it was especially significant in the U.S. market on a deal value basis. You can see in that third bullet point. So pretty clearly, the COVID-19 outbreak obviously impacted deal making in a number of ways. You can't do face-to-face meetings when you can't travel and you have to socially distance. But I think maybe just as significant, companies that are would-be acquirers need to reprioritize how they focus their efforts in the current environment, and in many cases, M&A is just going to have to take a back seat to dealing with the day-to-day disruptions and sort of fallout caused by the COVID-19 situation. So we'll see what happens in the second quarter and going forward as companies start to get used to the kind of the new normal, if you will, and we maybe a better handle on how the situation is impacting financial performance and how to interpret that, which is a good segue into the next slide, which relates to valuation and purchase price considerations. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic has very significantly disrupted operations and financial performance for many businesses, maybe most businesses. And that disruption really creates challenges for figuring out what the right metrics are for valuation and purchase price adjustments in the M&A context. So, for example, if you're looking at an EBITDA-based valuation and you have a month or two of significantly depressed or and it's very different performance in the past, whether because of increased costs or decreased revenue, or your working capital is out of whack because you're a non-essential business and you haven't been able to sell inventory, or your receivables are built up because you're not receiving payment. It just makes it very challenging, obviously, to come up with a valuation and the purchase price adjustment in the way you might have done so in the past, based on a steady state performance over a trailing 12-month period, say. And so this has an immediate impact on deal making because we're in the midst of the first phase of that disruption, but I think we're likely to see that continue for some period of time, since usually evaluations are based on some kind of 12-month look back, if not longer, and it'll take some time for this disruption to work its way out of sort of normal, quote unquote, performance. And then maybe in certain industries there'll be ways to normalize that measurement or net working capital measurements as we get a better sense of how future outbreaks or future financial impacts from COVID-19 can be managed. But for now, I think we're likely to see a lot more use of earnouts or other contingent or deferred purchase price structures to allow the parties to bridge that valuation gap, so that part of the purchase price is determined based on future performance of the business in a hopefully more normal state of economic conditions. Although the one caveat there is obviously that without a comprehensive approach to, vaccinating against coronavirus or really creating a predictable, steady state, some sellers would understandably maybe not prefer a contingent or deferred purchase price structure, since they can't be sure what that future state looks like, and they may not be able to realize the benefits of that potential earnout if the economy doesn't support achieving the earnout objectives or other increased purchase price objectives. And then kind of a related point, for deals that are debt financed, it may be challenging to put all these puzzle pieces together. It'll just require careful negotiation around how do you subordinate those potential future earnout payments to the required finance, the interest payments. And the priority for the senior lenders compared to the sellers who may be entitled to future purchase price payments and balancing that appropriately to get the deal done. So that'll just be a challenging situation to navigate in a number of cases where the buyer is using debt financing. And even if they're not using debt financing, a seller may want to look to get more financial information about the buyer to make sure that they feel comfortable that they're going to have a solvent purchaser to pay those earn-out payments if they become due. And then lastly, I think it's probably most relevant for public companies, but we'll probably see some uptick in use of buyer stock or equity as consideration compared to cash to facilitate more deal making, just valuing similar companies on a relative basis, maybe a little bit easier if you're using, for example, a ratio of equity values rather than cash to equity for purposes of setting a purchase price. But that's most likely going to be relevant to the public M&A markets. But it may have some relevance in the private or middle market as well. Let's go to the next slide. So pivoting from some of the market trends and valuation issues to kind of key deal terms, one definition that's always heavily negotiated is the material adverse change or material adverse effect definition, and it has an impact in the agreement, in your typical M&A agreement, in a number of ways. It's often almost always a closing condition that, from the buyer's perspective, they're not required to close if a quote-unquote material adverse change or material adverse effect has occurred. And you can see here on the slide sort of the pro-buyer version of this definition, which is taken from the American Bar Association's model asset purchase agreement. And this references any event, change, development, or occurrence that is or could reasonably be expected to be materially adverse. And you would think pretty clearly that would capture the current situation with COVID-19, but it's very difficult to establish that a material adverse change or effect has occurred, and it's in part because there are frequently exceptions, almost always exceptions to this definition, or whatever version of this definition you're using. And I think, in light of COVID-19, there will be increased emphasis on negotiating those exceptions. And then from the buyer side, sort of the exceptions to the exceptions in MAC definitions. So if we go to the next slide, we can see maybe an example of that in the context of COVID-19. So, a seller might look at that very pro-buyer definition from the last slide we looked at and say, well, that definition is not meant to capture, not meant to allow you to back out of closing based on, the occurrence of an epidemic or a pandemic, including COVID-19 or some evolution of that virus or another health crisis. It's really meant to capture things that are specific to the business being sold. And so we, seller or seller's counsel, want an exception to carve out from the material adverse effect definition any of these sorts of more generally relevant, more generally applicable health or pandemic related issues. And that approach would not be uncommon in the context of, for example, general economic changes or financial market conditions, industry conditions. Usually it is the case that the material adverse change definition is not meant to, or is not negotiated anyway to capture negative changes that affect the economy or even a particular industry as a whole. However, buyers will often push back to some extent for this exception to the exception that allows them to nevertheless claim that a material adverse change has occurred if the underlying set of circumstances has had a material or a whether it's not material, to the extent that it's had a disproportionate effect on the business being sold compared to other similar businesses. And I think there's an interesting question there in the context of COVID-19 about how you define, what is a similarly situated business for this purpose. So you could do it, and you often see it in agreements based on similar businesses in that industry. So if it's a auto supply chain manufacturer, maybe that's the industry that you compare the disproportionate effect to. But are you looking at businesses of a similar size? I think that's an interesting question, because COVID-19 will obviously have a more detrimental impact companies that maybe don't have the resources to weather disruptions as much as larger businesses. And then I think another interesting question and how this gets negotiated is whether you also have some kind of geographic element to this test, because there may be, going forward, different peer groups of comparable companies depending on where they're operating. If there are regional outbreaks or regional groups of states, for example, that allow or are either more or less permissive about businesses operating. So I think just in general, these exceptions and then the exceptions to the exceptions will be more heavily negotiated, obviously specific to COVID-19, to allocate that risk. But many people who have been through this process before will attest that the material adverse change definition can often be very kind of nebulous and not very objective as a way to allocate some of these risks, especially if there are some key things that a buyer is concerned about not wanting to close into. And so in those circumstances, I think it's more as important as ever, probably more important to consider, what are the specific things as a buyer that, or as a seller, that you'd want to put some objectivity around in terms of measurement for closing conditions or requirements to proceed with the deal. And so rather than just referencing a material adverse effect, maybe you're looking at specific financial metrics like revenue or customers or vendors continuing to operate and pay normal terms, or not having a material customer, a material critical vendor not be able to operate or be insolvent. Perhaps one of the closing conditions is that a key facility of the seller business is able to operate more or less normally, subject to social distancing and safety criteria. So just something to think about if and when you're in a kind of a resumed deal-making environment, whether to be more specific about those closing conditions if you want to rely on something that's more concrete than a material adverse change definition. Next slide, please. And then some other MAE or MAC related exceptions that are already pretty standard in transaction agreements that may be relevant to the COVID-19 situation are, and I alluded to one or two of these before, but changes in general economic, financial, or regulatory conditions that could obviously have some interplay with what the fallout from COVID-19 is. General industry conditions, changes in laws, with all the executive orders that are coming out, I think that can have obviously a negative impact on many businesses. And so if you have an exception for changes in laws, that could be pretty meaningful to the extent that between signing and closing, for example, there's some further executive order based on an uptick in cases or other circumstances. Acts of God, failure to meet projections or estimates is usually an exception, or is often an exception to the MAC definition, but there's almost always a carve out for the underlying reasons for that failure to meet projections still qualifying as an MAE or a material adverse change. And so I think there would just be more attention on how those already kind of customary exceptions work or don't work, depending on your perspective in the context of COVID-19. And then just a note, I think it's interesting to observe that down at the bottom of this slide, it's very difficult to prove a material adverse change. It has to be durationally significant in addition to having a material impact on the business. There's only been one case that's actually judicially concluded that there was an MAE. There have probably been some settlements that avoided a court having to conclude that. But during the aftermath of September 11th and also the following the 2008 financial crisis, there were no judicially determined or declared MAEs. It's only happened once, and it was not related to either of those situations. So again, just kind of a caution if you're a buyer in terms of relying on a no material adverse change closing condition. It's going to be an uphill battle if you're not more objective about your measurements and what would really constitute a material adverse effect. Next slide, please. Okay, so pivoting from the material adverse change or effect definition to some of the key representations and warranties that often get negotiated. So the seller is going to make some representations about the status of its business to the buyer that the buyer is going to rely on, both for purposes of potentially having recourse if it turns out something wasn't true, but also, if it turns out something was untrue and that was material to the business or the transaction, then the buyer may not have to proceed with closing, depending on how the deal is structured and negotiated. I think the customer and supplier representations are going to be subject to a lot more negotiation and scrutiny, just given how many businesses are obviously being upended by what's happening in the broader economy and various state executive orders around who can operate and how. And so typically you would see reps around, there have been no terminations of these key customer supplier relationships, no events of default under contracts, no adverse changes for key terms or conditions, payment terms, economics. Sometimes, you might have a buyer insist on getting a rep. There have been no attempted renegotiations or recent renegotiations of contracts. I think we'll see more of that. Plus, in some cases, potentially representations that no key customer or supplier has attempted to or actually declared a force majeure event under a contract with the seller or the target business, and that there have been no significant delays in deliveries or payments with those key business partners. No known bankruptcy or insolvency type issues, I think, will be important, just obviously given the financial distress that's likely to come out of the current environment is already kind of rippling through certain aspects of the economy. And then it would be interesting to see if we start to see some representations and warranties around whether certain key customers or suppliers are considered essential or non-essential or critical or non-critical businesses for a particular period of time, or if there's some other way to describe key customers or suppliers in the context of COVID-19 that gives a buyer more or less comfort that those key business partners are able to continue to operate in some version of normalcy. So that's something to keep an eye on. Just in general, though, I think it's good to be aware that it's going to be more difficult to obtain representation and warranty insurance coverage for these representations. It already was becoming more difficult in some cases pre-COVID-19 to get comprehensive coverage for these sorts of reps and warranties. But I think it'll be even harder going forward, and we'll get to that later. Next slide, please. So here's just a list of other key reps and warranties that I think are good to be mindful of, both on the buy side and the sell side. You know, if and when you're doing a deal in the future, or if you have a transaction that's pending. Legal compliance, obviously, that's going to be more dynamic for most businesses in the current environment than it has been in the past. Some businesses that may not have been as focused on compliance issues historically are now navigating, as I mentioned earlier, all these executive orders and new laws that are coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think there's just going to be more focus on making sure that buyer feels comfortable they have the coverage they need, but sellers similarly feel like they can give whatever rep is being asked of them in light of the sort of constantly changing landscape around particularly legal requirements related to safely operating or whether you can operate, and how similar issues around the labor and employment matter, reps and warranties, employee relationship issues, employment levels, compliance with employee-related laws or benefits-related issues. That's all very dynamic right now. So I think that will get more attention than maybe it has been for some steady-state businesses in the past. IT, cybersecurity, and privacy, these are already kind of hot-button areas anyway before COVID-19, but with more businesses working remotely, that creating some additional risk around cybersecurity and privacy and IT infrastructure, I think, you know, those reps will get more scrutiny, especially for businesses that, you know, have moved to, you know, a more remote workforce type situation for the time being, and may have some version of that going forward as things hopefully phase back into normalcy, whether that some work from home element remains or there's staggered returns to work. So these reps will continue to be very important. And then some of the financial related representations, which again, already very important in transactions, but given the disruption, the most recent, you know, 8 weeks or so of COVID-19, you know, what does that mean for inventory obsolescence, for example, or, you know, are your accounts receivable still collectible, or have some of your customers, you know, become insolvent? You know, there will be more focus on that set of reps and warranties and other meaningful financial metrics that buyers are basing their valuation on, or purchase price adjustment type provisions on. And then the last thing I wanted to call out, something I've been working on a lot over the last couple of months, is related to the various government, especially the federal government stimulus and lending programs, such as the Paycheck Protection Program, and then whenever it comes online, the Main Street Lending Program. I think especially in stock deals or equity deals, but probably in all types of transactions, both asset and equity deals or mergers, which are basically just a different form of an equity purchase in most cases, you'll see, I think, more focus on reps and warranties about levels of participation and validity of participation in these programs, since they do create some risk of exposure to a future audit or a whistleblower complaint, especially if you're buying the company that made certifications to participate in these programs, as opposed to just some assets and leaving the company that made the certification behind. If you're buying the company itself, then you're buying some of that risk related to future audits or future claims. And you may also be, depending on the program, restricting some of your future business operations. For example, in the Main Street lending program, even if you've paid back your loan, you still have some, up to a year, in some cases, of restrictions on dividends or limitations on executive compensation and things like that. So it's important to be mindful of, what those restrictions might be if you're buying the stock of a company or the equity of a business. Normally as a buyer, get pretty comfortable that if you just pay off the existing indebtedness of the business and you've reviewed those loan documents that the buyer or the seller may have had in place before, you get comfortable that, you're closing into a situation where you own the assets and you can do what you want with them. But that may not be the case if the debt is originated from a federal stimulus program. So I think we'll see more due diligence and representations and warranties around that. Next slide, please. Okay. So here's this topic of ordinary course of business and what does that mean? It comes into play in a few ways in M&A agreements. And I'll just hit on a couple of the more obvious ones, but it does sort of flow through to many aspects of the agreement, even beyond this. But the two most basic places are one, you will have a backward-looking representation typically that's communicating that the seller's business has recently operated in the ordinary course. And we'll go through some more specific examples of things that would not be considered ordinary course. But as a typical matter, you would go back to probably the date of the most recent audited financial statements and say, since that date, the business has generally operated in the ordinary course. And so if you were looking back to December 31st, 2019 and saying that the business has operated in the ordinary course since that date, you'd obviously have to get into some pretty meaningful disclosure in most cases around COVID-19 resulting in non-ordinary course operations. And then similarly, on a forward-looking basis, if you have a period of time between signing and closing, there would almost always be a requirement for the seller to operate the business in the quote-unquote ordinary course prior to closing. So in both these cases, COVID-19 environment is obviously not ordinary course. And particularly in the situation where you have this period of time between signing and closing to satisfy closing conditions, the seller is reasonably going to need appropriate flexibility to allow for safe operations should there be new developments related to COVID-19 or new circumstances, new executive orders, new legal requirements, to be able to comply and safely operate without constantly going back to seek buyer permission to do those things that may be truly necessary to operate, even though they're not ordinary course. So I think that negotiation, particularly in transactions that may have a longer period of time between signing and closing, will be very interesting. On a similar vein, there may need to be some loosening around language about maintaining consistent relationships or levels of employment with employees, given the fluidity of staffing needs and staffing availability in some cases, and then also with other key business partners. If a employer goes bankrupt, it's hard to commit to maintaining a relationship with them in the same way as you have in the past. One potential path that this might follow is buyers and sellers developing a sort of a roadmap or a set of principles around COVID-19 measures or response plans that would apply or sort of generally govern what's permissible or not, or what's envisioned or not between signing and closing in relation to responses to COVID-19 and new developments on that front. So I think that'll be, especially in larger transactions with more facilities or employees in that are being considered. I think developing some parameters around that will be good for both buyers and sellers, so that they're on the same page about predicting as much as possible how they would see the seller business reacting to new developments or worsening of existing conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, so shifting a little bit to just timing issues, closing conditions, regulatory approvals. I think it's probably clear that regulatory approvals in many cases are going to be obtained, it's going to be slower getting government approvals for transactions, especially if they require any kind of formal review or proceeding. So transactions with more significant antitrust implications potentially that will require a second request of information from the FTC or the Department of Justice to be able to clear or not clear a transaction for closing. That's clearly going to take more time. Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, I think, kind of non-U.S. purchase of a U.S. business right now, that's going to be very slow going. If it's something that is impacted by CFIUS, has any kind of national security related implications or critical infrastructure type implications, that's just going to take a very long time to get done. And, putting the perspective of perspective of another country, I think the reverse is true. So, European Union merger reviews or approvals, any other international jurisdiction, if you have multiple countries involved, especially, you're very likely to have, long lead time approval or review issues. And so that combined with the fact that other closing conditions may take longer to satisfy, like obtaining key third-party approvals or consents, getting shareholder approvals, maybe running out debt marketing periods for debt finance deals, that's just all going to take longer. And so most transactions that, have closing conditions or a period of time between signing and closing will have what's called a drop dead date. And if the deal hasn't closed by that date and the party that wants to walk away hasn't done anything wrong, so to speak, to prevent the deal from closing by that time, they can terminate and basically walk away at that point. I think it'll be important to have either just longer drop dead dates at the gate for transactions that have any of these approvals or third party consent requirements, or alternatively, or maybe both, using some kind of automatic extension of the drop dead date based on status of other closing conditions or the impact of COVID-19 on the seller business operations, things like that. And none of those are really new concepts. This automatic extension mechanism will just be applied more directly in relation to specific approvals or impacts caused by COVID-19. Next slide, please. And then for transactions that are insured by a representation and warranty insurance policy, which has become kind of the norm for middle market and larger transactions over the last 5 to 10 years in the U.S. Rep and warranty insurers are actively implementing already new practices relating to COVID-19. Obviously, insurers don't, this is an obvious, but insurers don't typically insure, known risks, and COVID-19 is generally in that category. But there are now, specific exclusions for these COVID-19 exposures and the government responses to coronavirus being baked into the rep and warranty insurance policies. And some of the language that I've seen, varies quite a bit depending on who the carrier or the underwriter is, but they're rather broad exclusions. And in addition to the exclusions, there's heightened sensitivity around, looking at what the buyer due diligence has been related to these risks. And then if there are specific COVID-19 related reps and warranties, I think a lot of the insurers will seek to exclude those from the scope of the policy, although this is all subject to negotiation between the insured, which is almost always the buyer in the transaction and the underwriter. And then in some cases, some of the language for these exclusions that they extend to first, third, key business partner, labor disruptions, supply chain disruptions, impacts on customers, for example, bankruptcy. If there's an insolvency of a major customer, that may not be covered. So some of these exclusions can really, although they are under the name of a COVID-19 exclusion, they can really be quite extensive and really create a gaping hole in the coverage under the policy. So, I wouldn't just accept a broad exclusion in the policy if you're doing an insured deal, and make sure you try to tailor that and limit it as much as possible so that you're getting you're getting the coverage that you're paying for. That said, I would, be prepared to address the COVID-19 related risks as if they're not insurable, just like you would have before rep and warranty insurance, so that those may be things you need to negotiate directly with the seller to allocate the risk, but in case or to the extent that you're not able to get covered under your policy for it. Next slide, please. And that leads into one of the final points here, which is just, it's always important, obviously, the due diligence that a buyer does and a seller does on itself to make sure that they understand the business, or in the case of the seller, that they're properly representing what the business is. But the more extensive rep and warranty insurance exclusions and the very dynamic environment we're in, due diligence is just more important than ever, of course. And it cannot be viewed as just a kind of a rote box checking exercise by buyers in particular. It's got to be really thoughtful and multidisciplinary. So I think effective due diligence is going to require more collaboration and cooperation across disciplines, so that the accounting team understands some of the concerns of the operations team and they're thinking about those together, and legal is working with the finance group to understand, beneath the reported numbers, what are the trends that, then have an impact on the reps and warranties that are being negotiated. That was always important, but I think that'll be even more important so that there are fewer blind spots in the due diligence process as we're in this really fluid situation. And then, in the legal area, just again, this is always important, but just more emphasis on collaboration across practice areas, given the fluidity of changing government requirements around labor and employment or workplace safety, changing utilization of IT assets and cybersecurity or privacy issues resulting from that. And then when you combine that with the fact that people are working remotely, it's just really got to make a concerted effort to cooperate and collaborate across practice areas and functions more than ever. And then I would say also, I think diligence, while it's always been forward-looking to some extent, not just looking back at historical risks, I think, one important element of the forward-looking diligence here is, what plans is the seller or the target business developing or creating to emerge as a stronger business through this difficult situation, and making that a part of the due diligence exercise as well. So I think the overall theme is just a further dilution of this distinction between quote-unquote business issues and quote-unquote legal issues, where the two really are often one and the same. it's just more important given the current environment. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, this is sort of a potpourri of issues that we've discussed related to M&A trends or negotiated points in deals that may be impacted by COVID-19. But at a 10,000 foot level, to wrap up, obviously the current M&A market has been very meaningfully depressed by COVID-19 and its impacts. My personal view is that the COVID-19 situation will have a significant impact on certain aspects of the M&A process and practices around getting deals done that will last beyond just the immediate next quarter or so, and that this experience will, as many disruptions do, create opportunities to develop new ways of working and new ways of looking at what your best practices are. So I think there will be some lasting elements that come out of this situation. Some of these quote unquote new developments are really just kind of an acceleration of things that were already underway, but I think it would be hard to overstate maybe the extent to which the situation will hasten some of those changes, like more collaborative due diligence and just sort of focusing more on objective criteria for closing deals and maybe moving away from standards that are vague and other things that are probably happening anyway in the deal market will be accelerated by what's happening in the broader economy. And then just being prepared for a less predictable and less stable M&A market in the near term and probably longer than that is important. So, we're likely to have, until there's a reliable vaccine for COVID-19, I think we're likely to have various waves of outbreaks and more volatility in economic activity in general, which will result in less predictability in M&A practice and less stability in that arena as well. So I think it'll be important and it always has been important in the M&A market to be able to move quickly, but carefully. It'll be more important than ever to be kind of prepared to, if you're a buyer, to take advantage of conditions that are good for transactions, and as a seller to be ready to similarly do so if there's an opportunity to exit that's desirable, and there's a window of time where the valuation makes sense and a deal can get done, to be able to move quickly to do that. So being prepared for those things, I think, is critical. And that's really all I had for today. Obviously, our group will continue to monitor developments in the M&A markets and be available to answer questions. We are all available if you want to reach out to me or any of my colleagues in the M&A practice. The firm as a whole is approaching the COVID-19 situation on a multidisciplinary basis. So if you have another contact in the firm at Miller Johnson, obviously you can reach out to them, and we're all available to assist as folks are moving through these challenging times and working through these issues. So thank you very much for participating in the webinar this morning, and I hope that they have a great day and you're doing well, staying healthy. Take care.